What if the most controversial part of Archie and Lilibet's story isn't something explosive that happened behind closed doors, but something far quieter? What if it's not a secret confession, or a shocking document, or a hidden witness, but a pattern? But before we continue, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for updates. A pattern so subtle that most people felt it before they could ever explain it. A pattern so uncomfortable that it was easier to argue about rumors than to ask why the basic facts always felt unfinished. Pause for a second. Think back to when you first heard the announcements. The smiles, the headlines, the carefully chosen words, the global excitement, the relief, the celebration, and then think about the feeling that followed. That faint sense that something didn't quite settle. Not wrong, not scandalous, just unresolved. Tonight, we're not here to make accusations. We're not here to chase internet theories or sensational claims. We're here to examine something far more interesting and far more revealing. At 41, Prince Harry hasn't suddenly dropped a bombshell confession about his children's births. That's not how this story works. Instead, he's done something much more subtle. He's spoken, he's written, he's reflected, he's clarified some things, and carefully avoided others. And in doing so, he's unintentionally highlighted what many people sensed all along, that the story we were given wasn't exactly false, but it also wasn't complete. And completeness matters more than people like to admit. Because in the royal world, birth stories aren't just personal milestones. They're symbolic events. They're historical records. They're moments where tradition, legitimacy, trust, and public faith intersect. When those moments feel unclear, the confusion doesn't disappear. It spreads. So let me ask you something directly. Why, years later, are people still debating this? Why hasn't time buried these questions the way it does with most royal controversies? Why do even reasonable, non-conspiratorial observers say the same thing over and over again? I'm not claiming anything. I just don't understand why it was handled like that. That sentence alone tells you everything. This isn't a story driven by wild suspicion. It's driven by discomfort with ambiguity. And ambiguity, especially when it involves powerful institutions, tends to linger like unfinished business. Now here's where timing becomes critical. Prince Harry is 41. That age isn't arbitrary. For many people, it's when life stops feeling like a reaction and starts feeling like a reckoning. When protecting the past collides with shaping the future. When legacy stops being theoretical and becomes personal. You start asking questions like, what will my children inherit? What story will they be told about where they came from? What version of events will survive me? Harry has spent years talking about truth. His truth, emotional truth, institutional truth, the cost of silence, the damage of distortion. And yet, when it comes to the births of his own children, arguably the most defining events of his life, the narrative remains oddly fragmented. Not dramatic, fragmented. And fragmentation is revealing. Because if something is truly straightforward, clarity tends to follow naturally. Even with privacy, even with boundaries, even with pain. But when clarity doesn't arrive, people start filling in the blanks. That's not malice. That's human nature. And Harry knows this better than most. He spent years criticizing the media for doing exactly that, filling gaps, speculating, dramatizing. But here's the uncomfortable contradiction. Silence invites speculation just as much as lies do. So why accept one and condemn the other? That tension sits at the heart of this entire story. This isn't about accusing anyone of wrongdoing. It's about understanding why certain questions were never cleanly closed, and why, years later, Harry's own words have reopened them. Listen carefully to how this unfolds. Because nowhere in Harry's interviews does he say, here's the truth you've all been missing. Instead, he says things like, it was complicated. It was painful. It wasn't handled well. We were trying to protect ourselves. We didn't feel safe. We didn't trust the institution. All emotionally valid statements. But also statements that subtly shift attention away from factual clarity and toward emotional justification. And again, that doesn't mean anything improper happened. But it does raise a quieter, more unsettling question. If everything about these births was exactly as presented, why does the explanation always sound like a defense? Why does it feel like something that needed managing rather than celebrating? Think about that. When most people talk about the birth of their children, even under difficult circumstances, there's usually a sense of grounding. A return to basics. Dates, moments, memories. With Harry, the emotional narrative is vivid. The logistical narrative? Less so. And that imbalance is where suspicion is born. Not because people want to doubt him, but because the story doesn't land with the weight of finality. And then there's the royal context. Royal births are not casual affairs. They never have been. They're institutional events wrapped in personal emotion. The public doesn't demand access out of entitlement alone. They expect transparency because that's how the monarchy historically earns legitimacy. And when Harry stepped away from that system, he also stepped into a paradox.